The principle of original natural possession of the ground is, I have the innate right to be on the ground, to take up a spot on the earth, where nature or coincidence put me, that is, without my own choice. Everyone else, however, on the same shared ground of the earth, with whom I am in the outer relation of possible mutual influence, because of the unity of the surface of the earth, has the same right along with me. Immanuel Kant. In my last two lectures, I described what Kant calls the private right. That is, the right, the law, the justice, however you want to call it, as it should exist according to reason, even independently of any contracts of any state that enforces that right. And I discussed how to Kant there are both innate rights and there are acquired rights. The innate rights are basically what we would call human rights nowadays. They are rights to that what is mine by birth. Because the right as such is about what Kant calls the mine and yours. It is about property. But the innate right is about what is mine by birth, like my body, which mustn't be harmed by others. And ultimately, the innate rights are all about one thing. They are about freedom. I have a right to my freedom, and others mustn't interfere with my free choice. But then there's also acquired right. That is a right to something which is not mine by birth, but as the name suggests, which I acquire, which becomes mine at some point. And these acquired rights, I can acquire a right to a thing temporarily through actually holding on to that thing, through physical possession. This follows analytically from the innate rights. Because I have a right to my freedom, that means that if I take a thing that doesn't belong to anyone else into my hand, or if I stand on a ground that doesn't belong to anyone else, then no one has a right to just take it from my hand or to just push me off that ground. Meaning I now have a right to that thing or to that ground, but of course that is only temporary. That is only as long as the physical possession keeps being a thing, and as soon as I let go of the physical possession, then I let go of that right. Now, this, however, if this was the only type of acquired right, that wouldn't work. That would create a world without property. That would create a world where someone could go onto a piece of land and start farming it, start putting seeds into the ground. But then as soon as he leaves for a moment, someone else could come and ruin the field by building his house there. And then as soon as he leaves his house, someone else could come and could tear down the house. So Kant says this would lead to a world where usable objects, that is, things that reason, that rational beings could take up to use in some sort of rational manner, things that could serve as means to our purposes, it would create a world where usable things become in the end unusable, and that would be a self-contradiction, and therefore would go against reason, would go against the categorical imperative. So there must be property, because only if there is property, only if I have an exclusive right to certain things and other people have no right to interfere with my use of those things, only then can we act rationally in this world. Only then can we really make plans. And even our innate rights, like our right to live, to freedom, ultimately depend on these acquired rights, on this property. which is why Kant says there mustn't just be temporary properties through physical possession, but there must also be what he calls intellectual property, which is not, as maybe you might think today when hearing that term, which is not a property to an idea, to a story or whatever. It can be the property of a quite physical object like a house, but it is intellectual insofar as there doesn't need to be a direct physical connection to your property that can be experienced, that can be perceived. That is, you don't need to be inside your house to own it, but rather the property is intellectual in the sense that the connection between me and that thing is one we just think, even when not directly experiencing it in the sensual world. In the intellectual world, in the kingdom of purposes, my free choice is still connected with that object I own because it is part of my purposes. It is a means to one of my purposes. And these connections, these property relations that we don't perceive but think, we can think in 12 different ways, because that is just the structure of our thinking, that we can think of connections in 12 ways, which Kant describes in his table of categories of the rights, which I have described in my previous lecture. Now, all of that is fine and good, but it still begs the question, how can you acquire a right? That is, how can something that wasn't yours by birth become yours? Because once it is yours, sure, we can think that according to those 12 categories. But the question is, how does this relation start? How is it? Because Kant says, if I have a right to an object, that is, if that object is my property, what that means is that I restrict the freedom of all other human beings, right? There are currently about 8 billion of us. And when I say this object there is mine, usually anyone could use any object. I explained that 2 lectures ago in the lecture on innate and acquired rights, that Kant says in nature we have no positive right to things. We cannot say this thing is mine, it belongs to me. But we have a negative right to everything. That is, we can use everything and no one can tell us off. No one can tell us you don't have a right to use this, because this thing belongs to nobody. Well, as soon as I say this over there is mine, I'm saying all you 8 billion other people, every single one of you, I am now restricting your freedom. In the state of nature, with no property, you have the freedom to take and use whatever you want. No more. Now your freedom is restricted. This one thing over there, since it is mine, you mustn't use. So I am limiting the free choice of all other human beings. I'm creating for all other human beings the duty to stay away from this object when I say this object is mine. The question is, how is this possible? How is this not presumptuous? In other words, how is property not theft, as the saying goes? And to be clear, this question, which is a central question of the philosophy of right, it is the question for what has been termed original acquisition, right? Because once original acquisition has taken place, it is easy to think how further acquisition may happen. Like, it is no big question how I can acquire something by buying it or by being gifted this thing, right? This is no problem, because then it already is someone's property. He has a right to that thing, and since he has a right to that thing, he also has a right to transfer that right, to say, okay, I will now abstain from this thing, I will now no longer use that thing, instead I allow you to use it. But how did he acquire that right? Probably he too bought it from a third person, and that third person bought it from a fourth person. But how did the first person take something which belonged to no one, and how did he acquire a lasting right? Not just the right of physical possession, the right that while he held onto that object, no one was allowed, because that would have interfered with his freedom, no one was allowed to take that object from his hand by force. But how did he acquire an intellectual right to that object, so that even if he puts it down, it is still his and must not be touched by others? And to be clear, when the philosophy of right asks this question, it is not asking historically. This is not about how historically property started, but rather it is asking legally. It is asking what is the rightful beginning of property. Maybe the historical beginning was not rightful. Maybe the historical beginning involved violence, involved someone just saying, this is mine now, and if anyone else touches it, then he gets beaten up. But the question is there a rightful way to acquire something? Is there a way to acquire something where we could say, this is just, it is indeed right that this belongs to that person? Not just he can enforce his will because he's stronger than others, and through violence he can make them stay away from that thing, but rather they really should stay away from that thing. It is right that they leave it to him, that it be only his. That is the question that the philosophy of right asks. And well, many people, of course, don't ask that question nowadays, because we are in such a developed society where property has existed for thousands of years, and original acquisition is not something that usually happens, right? Usually when we acquire a thing, I mean, you can look around in your place and ask yourself, whatever is your property, how did you get it? How did it become your property? Usually nowadays it already was someone else's property, and we got it as a gift, or we bought it, or whatever. Rarely nowadays do we own a single thing which was not previously owned by somebody else. And if we do, it's usually something small and trivial where people simply don't care that we took it for ourselves, right? Like, sure, you can go to a forest and pick up a stone from the ground and take it with you to your home because you like the shape, and you put it somewhere because you think it looks nice, and now it's yours, sure. But for the most part, original acquisition is not taking place. And so most people would not ask this question, would probably even think that question useless. But then they are simply being unphilosophical, because that is what philosophy is about, not taking things for granted. Philosophy, as Plato says, starts with wondering. So not just accepting that property and acquiring property is a thing, but rather asking, in this case, how can that be? How can it ever be rightful to say something which by nature is not mine now is mine, and I now restrict the freedom of all other people? They now mustn't touch this. Can that ever be a just action? And I would say that the question is indeed important, because when we ask about social justice, how can we ask this and how can we answer the question what is just without asking about original acquisition? Like, if you are wondering, is it just that some people have so much? Is it just that they are billionaires? You cannot just answer this by saying, well, maybe it's just because they worked for it, or maybe it's unjust because the billionaire has not worked 1 billion times harder than some poor cleaning lady or whatever. But that's not really a proper answer. Because if you ask, is it just that someone owns this thing? Of course, you have to ask, how did he come to own it in the first place? And was that first acquiring of that thing, was that just? Because if it was, then owning it is just. If it was not, then maybe it's not just. So this is the central question. The question of original acquisition is a central question for the philosophy of right. It has always been, and it is an important question for Kant also, even though I find that usually when Kant's philosophy is discussed, it's skipped over for the most part. Well, what is the answer that Kant gives? Let's first start by saying that in general, the answer must start from the innate rights, right? If we have innate rights that we are born with, and we have acquired rights, and now we are asking, how can we acquire a right? How can that ever be just and rightful? Then I think it is clear that this can only work through the innate rights. Somehow there must be a bridge from the innate to the acquired rights. In other words, somehow it must be one of our innate rights to acquire a right. Otherwise, acquired rights cannot be. This, I would think, is something that various different theories of original acquisition agree on. Where they disagree is how exactly they bridge from innate to acquired rights. In the case of Kant, what he is trying to do is to deduce the acquired right from our right to the ground. His whole theory depends on his theory of the ground. Now, 2 lectures ago, in the lecture on innate and acquired rights, I said that Kant also calls the innate rights the inner rights, because they are rights to, so to say, what is inside of me, like rights to my own body, or the right to my own freedom, while the acquired rights Kant also calls outer rights, because they are rights to things outside of me, things that are not me, to other objects that I may own. Kant says that the right to the ground, to a piece of ground, is the only right that is clearly an outer right, because the ground is not me, it's something outside of me, and yet it is not an acquired right, it is an innate right. That is, it is a right that I have by birth. And if that is the case, then here we have our bridge, right? We have here a bridge between the innate and inner to the acquired and outer rights in the form of an innate and yet outer right. What does Kant mean by that? What does all of this mean? Well, Kant would say we are, of course, rational beings. This is why we even have rights in the first place. But we are not pure rational beings, right? We are not God. Rather, we are sensual beings also. we exist in the sensual world. We exist in bodies. And that means we exist in space. We necessarily have to occupy a certain place in space. For us as human beings, there is no other mode of existence. Maybe after death, when we are just a soul, Kant would say. But as for now, in our life, it is not possible for a human being to exist except by occupying a certain part of space. That's the premise number one that I think no one can refute. The premise number two specifies this a bit more by adding that we can't fly. So we cannot just occupy any space, but rather we need to occupy a space on Earth. We need to occupy a piece of ground. You need somewhere to stand, somewhere, or to sit, or to lie, or whatever. Now, of course, technology has a bit evolved. Like even in Kant's time, the first balloons were created, and now we have planes and space shuttles and so on. So surely people can temporarily rise above the ground, but still, as a general rule, we need some sort of solid ground to exist. And this is crucial for Kant, because once again, we have these innate rights, which are rights to that which is ours by birth. We have a right to live, we have a right to exist. No one must take that from us. But if we had no ground to exist on, then effectively our right to live would be taken from us. Right? So let's say you occupy a ground. Let's say you stand at a certain point. Kant would say it is wrong for others to now push you from that point, or to force you at gunpoint to step away from there. This I already discussed 2 lectures ago. That is once again the temporarily acquired right that comes with physical possession, right? You physically possess the ground that you currently occupy, meaning you currently have a right to be there. Like I gave the example of being at the beach. If you lie down at a point of the beach, while you are there, no one should just push you away. Sure, if you get up and walk away and you come back the next day and find someone else on the exact same spot, you cannot say, oh, you are infringing on my rights, that is my spot, because the spot as such doesn't belong to anyone. It only belongs to you as long as you occupy it. But while you occupy it, it would be wrong to just push you away. Now, if someone still pushed you away, he would be hurting a right of yours. But at least he would not attack your right to exist at all. If he's just pushing you from that spot, you can still occupy another spot. But imagine now, if you're being pushed away, you try to go somewhere else, and there too you would be pushed away. And then you go to a third spot, and there too you are pushed away, and so on and so on. There would be nowhere where you could actually be, and therefore, since you need to be somewhere, since once again, as a sensual being with a body, you need to be somewhere in space, you could not be at all. Like, imagine a refugee coming to a country, seeking refuge, seeking asylum. If the country now says no, we don't want you here. You are blocked from this piece of land, from our land, and deports him. That is one thing, and we could discuss whether that is justified or not. But imagine he's deported back from his home country, and his home country were also to say, no, we don't want you back. For whatever reason, you ran away, so we don't consider you one of us anymore. You are blocked from here. And imagine he tried going to a third country, and the third country would also say, you can't be here, and so on and so on. And he would be pushed and deported from every single space on Earth. Then that would effectively mean that his right, and again, this is his human right, his innate right, to exist at all is denied. Even though no one might say it like that, and even though no one might actively kill him, to say you mustn't be, not just you mustn't be here at this spot, but you mustn't be at any spot, is akin to say you mustn't be. So if we are to have these innate rights, if we are to have the right to exist at all, Kant says, we need to have a right to one thing outside of ourselves, because otherwise the inner rights can also not be, and that is the right to a piece of ground. But now the next point is that Kant says the Earth is round. We live on a globe. That is important. I want to stress that Kant is a globalist, and this is important to stress for me because nowadays most people are not, right? Most people are flat earthers. Now, this might sound surprising, me saying that. It might sound a little crazy. You might think that flat earthers are a small and fringe group, and most people are not flat earthers. But just take the fact that, at least amongst right-wingers, globalist is actually an insult. Like, they think it is somehow a bad thing if you believe in a globe. I would say that, of course, very few people are honest flat earthers. That is indeed a small group of crazy people who say the earth is flat. But I would say most people are practical flat earthers. That is, they behave as if the earth was flat, as if things would not come back to bite you in the ass, as if they were with their country on a lone island and the rest of the world did not have to concern them. Kant, however, is clearly a globalist. Kant says we are stuck together on this earth, so to say. And this earth is limited. It might be where we was, and even more so in his times, right, when there were much less humans, and traveling took much longer. So there might be a lot of space for us, but there is not endless space. If you keep walking in the same direction, you will eventually return to from where you started. I mean, technically, you will have to not just walk, but also swim for a bit, but you get what I'm saying. So that means that human beings cannot avoid each other endlessly, right? Like, again, I can push someone away from some piece of ground. I can say, I don't want you here, go somewhere else. But this cannot be done indefinitely. At some point, I will have to accept some people as my neighbors, if I am to accept even their innate rights, their right to live at all, if I don't want to kill them. So, as human beings, we do need a piece of ground. And since we don't have, well, an endless number of disconnected pieces of Earth floating in endless empty space, but rather we have this limited globe. For that reason, we cannot push each other away endlessly. And that is why Kant says we need this idea of original shared property of the whole Earth, of the whole globe. We have to imagine all of humankind together. There is nowadays all 8 billion people together having shared property of all of the Earth. And originally, anyone could be anywhere. Since we all own the Earth together, all of us own all of the land. Originally, everyone has the right to be anywhere. But of course, that would create conflict because two people cannot stand at the exact same spot, right? And of course, people might also need a bit more than just a spot to stand on. Like maybe they need a piece of land to farm in order to have something to eat. So that is why Kant says it would be rational to divide the earth and give everyone a piece of land of his own. But again, this can only be done if originally the whole undivided earth belongs to everyone, and now everyone comes together and agrees with one another to divide the earth. Clearly, Kant is thinking here in terms of the third category of relation. I've said it before in previous lectures. The table of categories, which I have discussed in its own lecture, which you might check out to better understand this. The table of categories, describing the 12 basic categories of our intellect. That is, you could say, the 12 basic thoughts that structure all our thinking, is the key to understanding Kant's whole philosophy. Because if you agree with Kant that these 12 basic thoughts are the fundamental roots of all our thinking, then it stands to reason that everything that can be thought, including everything in philosophy, must follow the basic structure of these 12 categories. And indeed, Kant's thinking does. He always comes back to these categories, and you can therefore only understand him if you have understood these categories. Well, what Kant says is that there are 3 categories of relation. That is, if we think of relations between things, we can ultimately only think them in 3 different ways. We can think the category of substance and accident, as we can think of the relation a thing has with its own attributes. We can think of the category of causality. That is, we can think of the relation between a cause and the effect that it has caused. And lastly, we can think of community or of mutual action or of the whole and the parts. Kant sometimes gives this category different names, but what it means is we can think of a relation between various things where they are not completely independent things from one another, but rather they are interconnected because they together form a whole. And they are all parts of this whole. And within this whole, each part is determined by all the other parts. All the other parts give this one part its place in the whole. And likewise, this one part gives the other parts their place in the whole. So, and this category is the one that Kant is employing here. So he thinks of all of humankind forming a whole, and all of the earth forming a whole. And now it's divided into parts. This shared right that we all have of all of the land is split up into specific rights where everyone gets an exclusive right to one piece of the land, and all other human beings abstain from that land in return for him abstaining from their land. And so here the one part is determined by all the others, right? Because all the other land on the earth is occupied by someone, belongs to someone else. I now have no right to be there. I mean, unless I'm invited, but at first I have no right to be there. Well, I must be somewhere, so that leaves only one piece of land to me. The one piece of land that no one else has a right to must therefore be mine. It is determined by all the other people. But likewise, for every other person, the same is true. For him, I and everybody else that is not him, since we all occupy our pieces of land, we leave only one piece of land to him, and therefore he must have the right to that piece of land, right? Since person A is standing here, he is now making it impossible for person B and person C to be there. And on the other hand, A must stand there because person B and person C standing elsewhere make it impossible for him to stand elsewhere and only leave him this one space. So, once again, Kant's argument is we have one innate outer right. That is, by birth, we have a right to a piece of ground because we have the right to exist. That is an innate inner right, and we cannot exist without a piece of ground. Since originally we all share this same earth, and we originally have a right to be anywhere on this earth, right? Again, this is this original negative right. That is the right to use anything usable that does not belong to someone else. Like if there was only one human being on the earth, he could be anywhere, right? You could not say he has a positive right to be somewhere, because a positive right must always be a right given to you, acknowledged by other people. A positive right always means that you have an exclusive right to use this, like to be on this ground, and others cannot be there without your permission. That would not make sense if he was alone. But if he was alone, you could say he has a negative right to the whole earth. That is, he could be anywhere, and it would never be unjust. It would never infringe on anyone else's right, because there would be no anyone else, right? So originally, I have a right to the whole earth, but so does everyone else, meaning we have a shared right to the whole earth. And now, according to this category of the whole and the parts, we must divide the earth so that there are no conflicts, giving each person an exclusive right to a specific piece of ground. Now, of course, Kant is saying that in the state of nature, that is, if there's no state, no government, no laws, in the state of nature, all of this is just an idea. He's not saying this is how people would really think of this. People would probably just go wherever they want, and if a conflict arose, if someone wanted to be somewhere where somebody else also wanted to be, they would fight. But that's exactly the problem. That's exactly why we need to leave the state of nature, why we need to realize that which is just an idea, why we need to make it real through a social contract. through, well, forming a state together, right? Since in the state of nature there would always be conflicts about who can be where and what belongs to whom, we need to take this idea of the shared property of the land, and according to this idea, there must be a just division where everyone gets his piece of the land, and now there must be a state that enforces that. So it is precisely from here where we have the bridge, you could say, from private right to the public right, to, once again, to a state. And I want to start talking about public right in the next lecture, but first let's stick here for a little longer with the private right. So, to Kant, original acquisition is this acquisition of your piece of land that other people give you in return for you giving them theirs. Now, the question how you can acquire anything else, any items, for example, you might own, is easy to answer for Kant, because that is now derived from this piece of land you have, right? Kant would say this can be solved according to the first category of relation, that is the category of substance and accident. You can say that any item on a piece of land is like an accident of that land, the land being the substance. Now, of course, that's not applying this category in ontological terms. Ontologically, a substance is what exists on its own. So if you have a piece of land and there's a stone lying on that land, or there's, let's say, a deer standing on that land, the stone or the deer is not ontologically a substance of that land. It's its own substance because it exists on its own, right? You could move it on another piece of land and it would still exist. Rather, the stone would be a substance, and, for example, hardness or the gray color would be an accident of the stone. But we are not in ontology here. Rather, we are in the philosophy of rights. And if you think of this category of substance and accidents here, you could say that you could consider the ground a substance, and you could consider the things on the ground the accidents of that ground, meaning he who owns the ground owns anything that is on that ground. And that is how Kant describes it. He would say, if you have a piece of land, you have a right to everything you get from there. Maybe you can mine that land. Maybe there's resources in the ground. Maybe there's coal or gold or oil or whatever. Maybe there's some source, some water spring on that land, and you own that water. And if there's a lake with fish, then you own the fish there. You can fish them and you can eat them if you want. And if there's trees growing on that land, then you own the trees. You can pluck the fruits from there, or you can cut the trees down and use the wood to build something with it or to make fire. And if there are animals that are currently on that land, then you also own these animals. Like if there's a bird, you can, or if there's a deer or whatever, you can hunt that deer rightfully because it is on your land. But only as long as it is on your land, Kant would say. So I can hunt this deer that is on my piece of land. I can shoot it, and if I manage to kill it, I can eat it. And no one else can get that deer because they would first have to get on my land, and that would infringe on my rights. But of course, if the deer runs beyond the borders of my land, if it runs onto somebody else's land, then now I'm not allowed to follow it. Rather now the other person has the right to do with it whatever he wants. So now the other person could shoot it, but of course also as long as it is on his land and doesn't leave the boundaries of his land again. So Kant would say this is how we first rightfully acquire something, by taking it from our land. And of course, if we want to keep it, then we can take measures to keep it. Like, let's stay with the animals because they tend to move around more than other items. If I don't want them to move beyond my land, and if I don't want, therefore, to lose my right to them, I can try to catch them and to put a fence around them, right, so that they don't run away. But originally, something is mine by being on my piece of ground, because what originally is mine is this piece of ground. And this might be a way of thinking that maybe nowadays is a bit more further removed from us. Nowadays land ownership is not such a big thing anymore for many people. Of course, in some parts it still is, but like if you live in the city, for example, then you probably don't own any land. Maybe most of us nowadays don't own a single piece of land, and we maybe don't own a single of the things that we do own, because they were on our land, right? Like the food that I own, the food in my fridge, I don't own because I grew it myself on my own land. I own it because I bought it from some store. And the store also didn't own it because the store itself grew it somewhere, but rather they bought it from some farmer, right? So in our economically developed world, of course, acquisition is not just, or not even for the most part, the acquisition of something that was on my land. But what Kant is saying is that the original acquisition, so something that belongs to nobody, becoming somebody's property in the first place, that can only work through owning the land and taking what is on the land. And then it can stay yours even if you carry it beyond that land. And then you can sell it to somebody else who now owns it, not because it was from his land, but because he bought it. But originally, the original acquisition happens through acquiring something that was on your land. Maybe you own a pot of clay because someone else on his ground had clay and made the pot, while you on your ground, maybe you have a pond and you fish there and you exchange the fish for the pot. But originally, what you own is what comes from your ground, like those fish, and then everything else needs to be acquired through some sort of exchange or gifting, buying, selling, and so on. Of course, the question is how much ground can originally be ours? Like, where's the limit? How do we determine who gets which ground? And here Kant says it can only be as much ground as you yourself can defend and can push people away from. Like, of course, you can't own too little ground, right? If we were to say that you have 1 square centimeter, you cannot really live on that. Like, we cannot expect you to balance on that the whole time and to live off what you find on your 1 square, or even, let's say, 10 square centimeters or something. But then on the other hand, you cannot simply claim thousands of square miles of ground as your own, and say all this is rightfully mine, and no one else must step onto that ground or must take anything from that ground. If you imagine there is no state, there is no laws securing your property, but rather in the state of nature you must secure your property yourself, well, there's only so much you can secure, right? You can, of course, claim a land that is so big that you need 2 weeks to walk to the other end of your domain. You can claim that. But realistically, if your house is only one end, and now someone else steps onto your land on the other end and starts building a house there, starts hunting the animals there, or starts farming there, you would not even notice at first. And even if you were somehow notified, you would need 2 weeks to walk over there. And then maybe you could fight him off. Maybe you, with whatever you found on your ground, you built a weapon, and with that weapon, maybe indeed you managed to fight him off. But now you walk 2 weeks back to your house again, and in the meantime, the guy could just come back. So this space that is 2 weeks walking distance from where you live, this cannot be your property. You can claim it as such. You can say, I want this to be mine, but realistically it simply cannot be yours, because you cannot defend it. So, because remember, but all right is about to Kant. I discussed that in my lecture on right and ethics and their difference, where I said that to Kant, right is defined as those duties people have, like the duty to respect my property, not to take it, or the duty to respect my life, not to kill me. And those duties that people have, that can be enforced, that come with a right for me to force others to actually act according to their duty, right? Like if someone attacks me, if someone tries to kill me or tries to steal from me, I have a right to defend myself or to defend my property. That is, I have a right to use force to force him, if I can, to accept my rights. Well, I cannot force somebody to accept a vast area of space, of land, as belonging to me. There's only so much land where I could force somebody to accept it as mine, where I could force somebody off that land. And so therefore, that must be the boundary of my land, Kant says. Of course, if we leave the state of nature, if we have a state, then this could work. Then somebody could own much more land, because now the state would enforce this property, right? Now one guy alone doesn't need to defend his whole land, but rather if somebody were to illegally step onto that land, the police could interfere. But in the state of nature, and that is what we are talking about when we are talking about original acquisition, you can only own as much as you yourself can defend, Kant says. And I will point out in passing that this is a principle that he also employs in his what he says about international law, the law between states. Because here one question is, if a state, which of course owns some piece of land, if a state borders the sea, where do the borders of the state actually end? That is, does the state also own some part of the sea? Meaning it has an exclusive right to that sea, meaning other ships that don't belong to that state are not allowed to just enter that part of the sea, meaning you cannot fish in that part of the sea, meaning you cannot travel through that part of the sea, meaning you cannot mine that part of the sea for resources like for oil. That is something that in Kant's day was hotly debated, that states talked about. Of course, not so much the oil part in his days, but for example, where can we go and fish, or where can our trading ships pass through? And of course, this is something that still in our days states fight over. And of course, nowadays in international law, as a general rule, it is said that a certain number of miles off from the coast of a state still belong to the state, and then the wider sea that is beyond these miles, that is international waters. What Kant says is that in general, the ocean should belong to anyone. He's not saying there's a neutral place on Earth, like be it international waters, or also be it a piece of land that doesn't belong to anyone, like Antarctica, for example. He would say you cannot strictly say this is neutral, this belongs to no one, because if that were the case, then also no one would ever have a right to acquire it. Rather, to Kant, it's the other way around, it belongs to everyone. Because once again, let me remind you, to Kant, we, all human beings together, originally own all of the earth. And now we might divide it up and say that certain parts should be exclusively owned by that person or by that country. But originally, all of us together own all the land together, meaning everything that was not carved up, like the wider sea, international waters, is to be owned by everyone together, and therefore can be used by everyone, Kant would say. That is why everyone should be allowed to travel through there, or everyone should be allowed to fish there, and so on. And what Kant is saying is that the states should only own as much of the sea as they can directly defend, meaning they can only own as much of the sea as far as their cannons reach, right? Because that is literally what you can defend. If you have a cannon at the coast, and now a ship from another country approaches the coast, you can shoot at that ship, and thereby you can sink or drive that ship away. But of course, you can only do that as far as your cannon reaches. Beyond the reach of your cannon, you cannot really do anything against the ship being there. I mean, unless you send out your own ships, maybe. But you cannot do anything against it from the land that you own. And therefore, Kant would say this is what should determine the limits of a state's waters, the limits of its canon. I find that interesting because it's quite little. I mean, especially if you think of the technology in Kant's day, that is certainly much less than international law grants states in our days. Nowadays, it's several miles, certainly further than a cannon in Kant's day could reach. But on the other hand, we should also consider that technology has developed quite a bit, and especially ballistic technology has developed quite a bit since Kant's days. And nowadays, with things like intercontinental rockets, nowadays it's possible from any spot on Earth to shoot at any other point on Earth. Meaning that in theory, if we go with Kant's principle, one country could now say that all of the sea or that all of the earth should belong to it, to this country, because it can shoot at all the places and it can shoot at anyone, anywhere, who doesn't accept that this is this country's property. Which is why I think Kant's principle doesn't quite work. Fichte here would say that this just goes to show that any central principle, any principle taken from the central world, like how far can we shoot with our cannons in the central world, is ultimately arbitrary. It's something that can always change. Therefore, Fichte would say we need a rational principle. We need something taken from reason. But for Kant, this is the principle that he says everyone, originally we rightfully own all of the earth together. Therefore, everyone should rightfully own a specific piece of land and can then own everything that is on that land, can acquire everything that is on that land, as much as he can defend. And this is the basis for original acquisition to Kant. So in conclusion, and to summarize what I said, Kant would say that all property does start with the physical possession, with you literally possessing a piece of ground or that which is on that ground. And that is indeed the material condition of acquisition. You cannot originally acquire something if you are not connected to it in time and space. But from there, we can get to the intellectual property, that is to something also staying mine, even if I don't physically possess it. But for that, the formal condition of property must be met, and that is the social contract. That is others agreeing that this should be mine, that is others giving me that right. Specifically, to Kant, the original acquisition is a process that has 3 steps, which he calls the apprehension, the declaration, and lastly, the appropriation. So, first off, the apprehension. We must actually physically apprehend something in space. And this must also in time be the first apprehension. That is, we must apprehend something that nobody else has taken as his before us. I will note that the term apprehension is an important technical term in Kant's epistemology also, and I already gave a lecture on that. He reuses it here in his philosophy of right, but here it has a different meaning. And of course, these two times where Kant talks about apprehension must not be confused with one another. So I would say they have something to do with each other, and there's a bit of a parallelism, right? Because the apprehension is the first part in the threefold process of acquiring property. And it is also the first part in the threefold process of making experience. And when Kant talks about apprehension there in his epistemology, he's talking about our power of imagination, apprehending the various manifold sense impressions that we get, and forming them together into an image. While here, in the philosophy of right, when Kant talks about apprehension, he means us with our free choice apprehending an object, an item, to possess it, to make it ours. But be that as it may, the point is, the first step is the physical apprehension. like you step onto a piece of ground and thereby make it yours, or you take something from that ground which you made yours, like you pluck a fruit from the tree and thereby make it yours. Or you take the animal from your ground, like maybe there's a wild horse on your ground, you catch it so that it cannot run on away from your ground onto the ground of somebody else, and thereby you make it yours. Now, this of course just makes it your physical possession in that moment. We want to get to intellectual property, right? We want to get to this staying mine even when I let go of it. So this ground should be mine even if I step away from it. That is why we need now to get to the second step, and that is the declaration. The physical possession that I apprehended becomes my intellectual property, at least my provisional intellectual property, through my will, through me wanting this to stay mine. But I need to let other people know of my will, right? Otherwise, it's not even their fault if they take my property because they didn't know it was mine, right? If I leave my piece of land that I apprehended and there's nothing denoting that someone apprehended this land, then I cannot blame another person for coming and taking this land as his. Or if I let the horse that I corked go again, and there's nothing denoting that this is mine, and now it runs onto somebody else's land, I cannot even blame that person for catching that horse and making it his. So there needs to be a declaration of my will to possess this thing. And what Kant means by this is that I somehow must create a sign that this thing was apprehended. So, for example, when you take the ground, I could create some sort of border. I could fence in my ground, thereby notifying other people who come along, oh, somebody put up a fence here. So clearly, that ground is already someone else's possession. Or when I have an animal, I could put a collar around its neck, for example, so people, if that animal somehow gets loose and walk around, people would say, okay, this is not a wild animal that we are free to hunt and to catch, but rather this animal was already apprehended by somebody else, right? This is indeed what people often do, like think of herds of cattle being branded, for example. This branding would be what Kant considers the declaration of will, that this cattle should belong to me. And he's saying that this declaration can happen in a very primitive manner. It's enough to show that this item was apprehended by a human being. So Kant talks about Greenland and about the Eskimos of Greenland, and he says what they do, what their custom is that they pull driftwood from the sea, right? Because there are not exactly many forests in Greenland. So if they need wood for building or for fire, their main source of wood is wood that comes drifting by from the sea, and that they find on the shore. And he says they pull it from the water, and then they may first leave it on the shore, right? Because maybe it's too much or it's too big to just carry home. So maybe one guy who pulled it from the water now runs away and gets his pals to come with him, and then they carry it home together. And so, of course, in the meantime, they don't want other people to come along and to take this wood. So Kant says what they do is they take a stone and put it on top of that wood. And that's enough as a declaration, Kant would say. because the wood just laying there doesn't show me that a human being has apprehended it. I don't know if a human being pulled it from the water or if maybe the waves pushed it onto the shore. But a stone lying on top of the wood, that is unlikely to have happened simply by the forces of nature. So I can assume that a human being put it on top of there. And this is like sort of a reservation. This is showing, no, I want this wood to be mine. But then this declaration of will is also not enough, Kant would say, because others, of course, can ignore it. Others might simply not accept it. Like others could step over my fence, or others could still steal my cattle, even if it's branded or wearing a collar or something. Others could still take this wood, even if there's a stone on top of it. And not only that, also, if mere apprehension and then declaration was enough to make something mine, then I could easily occupy large parts of the world, right? Like, I could apprehend a piece of land by stepping onto it, and now I could declare this is mine, and then I could go on, walk to another piece of land, also stepping on it once, and then declare that this is mine. Like I could put up my sign there or something, and I could just walk on, right? I mean, consider that in Kant's days, in the age of in the 18th century, there were still discoveries happening, right? The British, the Dutch, the Spanish, and so on. They were going around in their ships and discovering new islands and then claiming them as theirs. And of course, if the islands were already inhabited by natives, then of course this is unjust, this is colonialism. But let's consider an island being uninhabited. Still, it's a bit too easy to say that one country can just discover an island with its ship, step on the island for 5 minutes, put up its flag there, and then go on to the next island, put its flag there, and so on. That way, it could acquire many, many islands, having apprehended them and having, through putting up the flag, declared that it wants these islands. But why should it have them? Why should others accept a country thereby just grabbing massive pieces of land that it actually doesn't even occupy or defend at this point? And this is why we need the first step, the actual appropriation. And that step can only happen, Kant says, through agreement. So I have apprehended a piece of land or an object that I found on that land. I have declared my will to own this, to keep it as mine, even when I'm not physically possessing it right now. Now I need other people to say, okay, this is fine, we accept this will of yours, and we will abstain from apprehending what you already apprehended and declared to be yours. But why should people do that? Well, only because I do the same thing in turn, right? Only because I also accept what they have apprehended and declared to be theirs. So we must form a contract where we each give or grant each other our respective claimed property. And we need to erect some sort of legal order, some sort of state, which now enforces this. Once again, this is why Kant says in the state of nature, there can only be provisional right, provisional property. That is something I have claimed as mine. And maybe I can defend if I'm strong enough, but that is not mine by law yet. And we need to leave the state of nature. We need to get into the state of law for something to be truly ours. That is exactly, once again, why we need to transition from private right to public right. So I will say that this is once again where Kant could have noted that the right is something that exists only in the state, and that the right must be separate from morality. Right? I discussed this already in my lecture on what is right, what is ethics, where I said that to Kant they both are parts of moral philosophy. Moral philosophy is sort of the umbrella of both of them. And I, going with Fichte, would disagree. I would say they need to be distinguished completely, and they make up completely different fields. And to Kant, in the state of nature, we already have rights. There is already a duty, a moral duty to respect people's rights, even if no state enforces it. And then if we go to public right, if we go to erecting a state, the state enforces these rights. But now here, Kant himself says that in the strict sense, you have no rightful property in nature. You have only stuff that you claim as your property, that you want to be yours, but it can only truly rightfully be yours by law once there is a state who says, yes, this is yours and I will defend your right to this property. This is, as I say, one of those instances where Kant could have realized, if he had thought a bit further, that the philosophy of right must be completely separate from moral philosophy. But that's it. That's Kant's theory of original acquisition, saying through apprehension and declaration and finally appropriation through agreement, we acquire something as rightfully ours, not just our temporary physical possession, but ours in an intellectual sense. And saying that from the material condition of property, that is actually physically apprehending something, to the formal condition, that is agreement, a social contract with other people, this is how we can get intellectual property. And so therefore our outer acquired rights come from the one outer right that is, despite being an outer right, an innate right, and that is the right to the ground. We all have this shared original right to the whole ground, and from there we can divide up the ground, everyone getting a right to a specific piece of ground. Now, this theory of the ground is the fundament of Kant's whole philosophy of right. Because, once again, this is how we acquire rights in the first place. And I find that you need to understand it to understand, well, the rest of Kant's philosophy of right. It is important for Kant's theory of justice, what possession is just. It is important for his whole theory of state right, of international right, and not last but not least, it is very important for his whole theory of cosmopolitan right. And you can only fully understand it if you get that Kant comes from this idea of the original shared possession of the whole globe. Which is why it is unfortunate that this is discussed very rarely. Like I would assume there are certainly many videos about Kant here on YouTube, for example, but I would assume that you will not find many other videos talking about his theory of the ground. Certainly it's discussed somewhere in some obscure academic papers, but it's certainly not amongst the more often discussed and more well-known parts of his philosophies, even though his whole philosophy of right hinges on it. I would say if someone talks about the philosophy of right without discussing the theory of the ground, he might even correctly explain some details, but the bigger picture will escape you if you don't start from this theory of the ground. But the question is, of course, what should we think of this theory? Is it correct? Does it have any merit? Well, let me start first with the merit it does have. I would say that I myself, I find myself reminded of my dad's philosophy, because in his philosophy, space and the feeling for space, sensing space, and granting space to others and to yourself is very central. Now, this is not a philosophy of right, this is a philosophy of life. But still, granting space is a central element. Growing up, my dad would often point at Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy Gentleman, which is a wonderful book, which I very much recommend reading. And in that book, the main character, Tristram Shandy, has this Uncle Toby, and wonderful character. And there's this one scene where there's a fly buzzing around, and Uncle Toby opens the window so the fly can fly out instead of killing the fly. And he says to this that the world is big enough for me and the fly. Even though the fly annoys me, I don't need to kill it. I can just open the window and give it some more space. And this is a scene that I would, again, growing up, Dad would often quote, because it very much captures this posture that his philosophy of granting space both to yourself and to others is about. And indeed, I mean, Lawrence Stern lived in the time of Kant, wrote in the 18th century, is an important author of British sentimental literature. And Kant liked Stern. And Kant too, at one point, refers to this very scene, even though I don't think that Kant had the same association that I have with his philosophy of right. But at least he does say that what Uncle Toby says here, there's enough space for me and the fly in this world, that this is something that anyone could and should probably take up as their motto. And I think this is indeed an important sentiment, because we live in a world where people often don't grant themselves space, and therefore they don't grant others space, right? This is interconnected. You only take others' space away if first you believe that you yourself have too little space, that you cannot live in this space, you need more space, right? I mean, think of the Nazis, who famously talked about the Germans as being a people without space and needing Lebensraum, that is living space, in the East. That was their whole reason and justification for trying to conquer the land of Ukraine, of Belarus. And genocide, not granting others their space to live, always comes from you not granting yourself space, you believing that you yourself have too little space, right? as long as you, like Uncle Toby, believe that there's enough space, you don't need to get along with someone. Like, you can be annoyed by the fly buzzing around, but you can say, okay, I have my space, you have your space, we can both live. Only if you believe I don't have my space is too small, do you need to take somebody else's space away. And this is unfortunately a widespread attitude. This is what we see currently in Ukraine. This is what we see most prominently in Palestine. I mean, just think about it. All those Israelis that are genociders, what they ultimately believe is that this space is exclusively theirs, and there should not be any Palestinians in this space, right? They constantly try to take over more of that space, settling the West Bank, constantly shrinking the land of the Palestinians, driving them into these essentially Bantustans, reservoirs. And the same is happening in Gaza, right? That from the start, the plan was to ethnically cleanse it, and if you can't get rid of all the Palestinians of Gaza, at least drive them into a smaller area. At least create some sort of concentration camp in the south, so that at least the northern Gaza Strip, that space, can be yours. And when you hear some of the Israelis talk, I mean, they want the Palestinians gone. Even if they may not say, okay, they should all die, they may say things like, okay, they should go elsewhere. They will say things like, if you love them so much in Europe, like for example, if the Irish love them so much, or the Spanish, why don't they take up Palestinian refugees? Or why don't they go to some Arab countries? I mean, they are Arabs too. The Arabs already have 24 countries, so why do they need a country here? They can go there. But the point is, well, if you say they cannot be here, they have no space here, this land does not belong to them, even if you don't say I want to kill them, the problem is, of course, if others won't have them. Because indeed, other lands, whether it is Ireland or Spain or Arab lands, of course, they already belong to somebody else. They already are inhabited. Then essentially, even if you are not saying it out loud, what you are saying is these people have no space at all. And to be fair, there's also people on the other side who think similarly, right? Amongst the Palestinians, there are certainly some such people, and amongst the people who are on the side of the Palestinians, amongst certain activists and so on, there are of course also some such people who will say that all the Israelis must go. Now, of course, that's not what everyone says. That's what everyone is accused of saying, right? You get accused if you criticize Israel of being an anti-Semite, of wanting to drive the Jews into the sea, even if you very clearly state, as people like Francesca Albanese have done thousands of times, that you want the whole land between the river and the sea to be a land for everyone. But still, there are such people who will say that the Israelis, the Israeli Jews, should go away. And here too, the question is, where should they go? Right? People will mindlessly say stuff like, oh, they came from Europe, they should go back to Europe. But I mean, maybe we could discuss this when it comes to people who actually themselves, in the course of their lives, as grown-ups, voluntarily moved to Israel, on whether they should go back. We could maybe discuss that when it comes to people with dual citizenship. But there are people there who have been born there and grown up there. People there whose parents maybe have been born there, right? Maybe it was their grandparents who immigrated to Israel. And they have never known another country, and they have no other citizenship. So where should they go? And I mean, it's easy to say they come from Europe. If a person has four grandparents, if it was their grandparents who moved to Israel, and maybe all four grandparents came from different countries, like you cannot now say, oh, he belongs to this country or to that country. And it is unlikely that such a country would just take that person because one of his grandparents happened to come from there. So this too would effectively have to mean genocide. If you say they have no space here, but other spaces are already occupied and won't take them, um, then they must die. And this should show how before the physical genocide, there's always an ideal genocide. That is, there's first genocidal thinking. There's first this thinking, these people must go, they have no space here. But also, I don't care if they even have a place to go. I don't care if elsewhere there is some space for them. And if you are already thinking that way, then it's not a big step to also act in that manner, to also actually realize this thinking in an actual physical genocide, right? And this should once again show the truth of Kant's moral philosophy, as I discussed in previous lectures, as I discussed, for example, in the lecture on the good will and the good deeds. Kant saying what matters in morality is not the actual actions, it's the will. That is, it is the actions we are capable of. What actual actions we do, that is how our will realize itself, depends largely on outside factors, not on ourselves, right? Like, I may have the goodwill that would make me save a person's life if someone was droning in front of me, but maybe I never get in that situation. So maybe I simply never encounter a drowning person, then I never save somebody's life, but not for lack of goodwill, just for lack of opportunity. Or likewise, I may have the will that would make me take revenge if someone murdered somebody from my family. Maybe I would then in turn murder him. And it just so happens that in the course of my life, nobody close to me ever gets murdered. So that's why I never take revenge. But not because I'm such a good or forgiving person, but simply because there's never any occasion to. So Kant would say what matters in morality is the will. And if we are to judge a person morally, which of course we can never fully do because we don't know someone's will, it's something that only God could do. But if we were to judge someone morally, not legally, right? For the legal judgment, it's the action that matters, not the inside, not the will of a person. But if we were to judge someone morally, we would have to judge someone solely by their will. And someone could be an utterly evil and rotten person, deserving of hell, without ever having done a bad deed. Because maybe he has this evil will that makes him capable of rape and murder and whatnot. But just he never got in a situation where that will realized itself in such actions. But if life had happened to put him in such situations, he would have done it. And so I would say that people can have a genocidal will that is in their mind, in their will, in their heart. They can already have committed genocide by saying these people have no space here, they must go. But it's just that there's no opportunity or no occasion for committing actual genocide. But if you have this genocidal will, then you are capable of it, and then if the occasion arises, you will do it. But that is precisely why this theory of the ground, that everyone has an inborn right to a piece of ground, to some space to live, why that's an important thought. In a way, this makes Kant the anti-Malthus in my book. Now, Malthus lived at the same time as Kant. Of course, his name is much less known nowadays than Kant's. Many people will not know who Malthus was. But I would say that actually there are much more Malthusians in our time than there are Kantians, even though most Malthusians don't know that they are Malthusians and have never heard of Malthus, but their manner of thinking is following Malthus. Because he basically had this life denying theory of fear, of lack, because that is what I would say fear is, right? Fear is always a feeling of lack. You have fear if you feel that your powers, your strengths is lacking, and therefore you don't have the capacity to deal with something. While on the other hand, I would say Kant's theory is life-affirming and is one of courage. And courage, Kant himself says, is the root of Aufklärung. I will get to that when I talk about his theory of Aufklärung. And I would say courage is a feeling of abundance, right? You are courageous when you have this feeling that I have enough. I have even more power, more energy than I need, and therefore I have the capacity to deal with what I'm facing. Well, Malthus was saying that there can be overpopulation. There can be a point where, so to say, all the land is occupied and all the resources already belong to someone. And now, if a new person is born and there are no resources, there is no land for him left, then Malthus says he basically has no right to live. He says quite frankly that at the great table of nature, there is no place prepared for him. Nature itself declares that this person shall not live, has no right to live, and nature also executes her judgment. That is, that person will die, will probably starve. And so this is the opposite of Kant, right? Who says that by being born we have a right to exist, and therefore we have a right to a certain piece of ground and its resources. Malthus says no, we don't. If there is nothing left for you when you are born, then tough luck, you have no right to live. And the thing is that Malthus, even though nowadays the name of this British thinker from around the same time as Kant is not very well known anymore, he did have his influence on a number of people, amongst them Charles Darwin. When Darwin, some decades later, came up with his theory of evolution, of the survival of the fittest, he was, by his own admission, influenced by Malthus in saying that in nature there is this constant competition for resources, this constant fight for survival, and not every creature in nature has a right to live, but rather those who cannot get their piece of the resources, they just die, and only the fittest survive, right? And indeed, I would say the theories of these biologists are very spatial. They are theories about a lack of space, if you think about it. I mean, the biologists themselves use spatial language. They will talk about the living space, the biotope, or they will talk about ecological niches. So they use spatial metaphors. But even if they didn't do that, if you think Darwin's theory through, I would say it comes down to a fight for space, because if there is competition in nature, the first instinct would usually not be to fight, but rather to avoid each other, to go your separate ways, right? If let's say there are two trees with fruits, and one tree has enough fruits for one animal to live off, um, and this animal is stronger, and there's a weaker animal which also wants those fruits, but cannot defeat a stronger animal, the weaker animal won't die. It will just climb onto the other tree and eat the fruits from there, right? Um, it is when there is a lack of space, when you cannot just avoid and find your own space, um, when it comes to this sort of competition and survival of the fittest. Now, it's well known how, in turn, Darwin's theories have been applied to humans, to human society in the 19th and 20th century, and what terrible consequences that had. It is well known how the Nazis talked in Darwinian terms, that there's a constant competition between human races, and there's a survival of the fittest, and there are subhuman races that need to go if we, the white, the Aryan, the Nordic race, are not to go. And likewise, even amongst your own race, there is not enough for everyone. You need to remove the bad elements, right? The degenerate elements, the disabled people, the people with inherited sicknesses. They need to be removed from what the Nazis called the gesunde Volkskörper, the healthy body of the people. And as I already said, to them the war was all about conquering living space for people without space. Now, nowadays, such theories, such attitudes are called social Darwinism. And of course, after the Second World War, after the experience we made with the Nazis, this fell out of favor a bit and largely got rejected. And nowadays, social Darwinism is considered evil and unscientific and so on. But what I find interesting, and what is something that many people are not aware of, is that Darwinism itself was based on Malthusianism. And you could say Malthusianism is social Darwinism. So while many people think that Darwinism was first and then it got applied to society, it's actually the other way around. Social Darwinism was first and then it got applied to biology. So instead of calling Malthusian attitude social Darwinism, it would probably be more justified to just call it Malthusianism, and to, on the other hand, call Darwinism bio-Malthusianism or biological Malthusianism. But be that as it may, my point is that Kant's theory, not starting from a theory of lack, but starting from a theory of abundance, saying there is enough space for everyone, and everyone who is born by birth has a right to his space. Kant's theory presents an alternative to this Malthusian attitude, and this attitude, unfortunately, even though not by that name, even though Malthus himself is a more obscure figure and not so well known, this attitude, unfortunately, amongst people and also in international relations, is very widespread. So this would be something where we could learn from Kant. In addition to that, a second merit of his theory is that from his theory of original acquisition, we would arrive at a certain equality of wealth of people, right? Since originally we can only acquire a piece of ground as large as we can defend so where we could drive other people off, and then whatever is on that ground, that would mean that originally everyone could own only about the same amount of ground. That is not to say that in the further development and course of things, there could be absolutely no differences in wealth. I mean, let's say two people both have a piece of ground and they both farm it, but maybe the one farmer is just working more and harder, or maybe the one farmer is actually inventing new tools to better plow the ground, and therefore that farmer grows more crops and can feed not just himself, but he can sell the crops to some others and thereby acquire some wealth. So then, even though both neighbors started out with basically the same amount of wealth, the one neighbor could become more wealthy. But what is not likely, if we start from this place where everyone owns about the same amount of ground, what is not so likely is that some people become billionaires while some other people are homeless. This much inequality is hardly possible if the starting point is equal. So with this theory of original acquisition, we could say that the wealth distribution that we have now in our societies is unjust. It cannot be just that one person has so much more than other people. This is simply not possible by just means. Because again, justly you can only, rightfully you can only own so much land and not much more land than others. So this unequal wealth distribution is only possible through unjust means, which is something that Kant himself already points out. He says when there's some people owning so much land, many hundreds of square miles of land, like for example the nobles in his time, and then there's other people that own no land at all, that therefore have to work for these nobles, have to farm their land. There must be an injustice that happened at some point in history. Like maybe this particular noble did not commit the injustice. He just inherited that land from his father and he from his and so on. But if you go all the way back before there was even a state, to the state of nature, it cannot be that the forefathers of the nobles had so much more land than the forefathers of those farmers. Because how could they have defended so much land from others? So at some point, an injustice must have happened, like someone conquered the land, someone used violence to drive others off that land, someone employed some thugs that worked for him that defended such a large land and drove others off it or whatever. And now the descendants are reaping the benefits of that original injustice, while the descendants of the victims of that injustice have nothing. That is something that Kant already points out. So I will also say that there's not really any consequence he draws from that, at least not for the philosophy of right. Kant does have a philosophy of right. He does have some sort of political philosophy that is about creating a rightful state, creating peace. But he does not yet have a real social philosophy. And while he does say that the large disproportionate wealth distribution is due to some past injustice for sure, there's no real plan in his philosophy for the state correcting that injustice. if there are consequences from this, they are largely ethical consequences. That is, those that are rich now, those that own a lot of land now, they should remember that they don't own this because they deserve it, but probably because their ancestors stole it, and therefore they should take care of the poor, they should give to the poor. But this is more of an ethical, a moral imperative to Kant. He does not have a theory how the state maybe should take property from the rich and redistribute it to the poor. This is a line of thinking drawing these sort of consequences that only starts with the next generation, that only starts with Fichte. He already has such a theory. You don't have to go some decades further to Marx, it already starts with Fichte. But with Kant, you have him pointing out that there was an injustice, but not yet developing a theory about correcting that injustice. But anyways, those 2 points I wanted to make. These are 2 things I would applaud when it comes to this theory of Kant's. But still, I would, in the end, reject his theory of original acquisition. There are interesting thoughts here. Again, it's good that he is a sort of anti-Malthus. It's good that he points out that too big disproportionate amount of wealth between people cannot happen unless through some injustice. But still, I would say that his theory as a theory of original acquisition does not really work. That is because, for one, I would say that Kant is sort of avoiding the actual question and only pretending to solve it. Not on purpose, of course. He himself was not aware of that. I'm not saying he's deceiving here. But I mean, the actual question of the original acquisition is, how can something that is not mine become mine? And Kant's answer is, through this original shared ownership of the land, of the globe, of the ground. But then he's saying by that there is already some sort of ownership. That's why I'm saying he's avoiding the question. The question is, how can I, if I don't own something, how can I get to own something? How can I acquire property? And in a way, Kant is saying we are not simply acquiring it, we already have property by birth. And yeah, that's not really a sufficient answer. There cannot be an original shared ownership of the land, because once again, if you are a bit more consistent than Kant, and if you properly divide morality and right and don't mix them up, then there are no rights and there is no property outside of the social contract, outside of the state. In the state of nature, you can claim anything as yours, and maybe you can even retain it as yours if you're strong enough to defend it, but you cannot say that it is rightfully yours. And even Kant himself, in a way, acknowledges that when he says that there's only provisional property. He's just not thinking it fully through and drawing the right conclusions from that. And also, a big problem I see with his theory is, of course, that this works if you really imagine original acquisition, like if you imagine people sort of spawning on an unowned land. But then what happens with the next generation? Like, you can say that originally 2 people both possess a piece of land. But what if one person uses his land, he farms it, he lives off his land, while the other person is maybe a drunkard, and maybe the other person doesn't farm his land, but rather sells his land. And now he uses all that money to just buy alcohol and to just drink it away. And now this second person, let's say, has a child. The child cannot inherit anything, right? Because all the property is gone. The land itself was sold, and even the money that is equal to the worth of the land, the money that it was sold for, was just put into alcohol and drunken away. So now that person would have nothing, while the other person now has both pieces of land. So what is the child of the drunkard to do? It's not his own fault that he has no property. It was his father wasting away the property. But now there he is. He has no property. Kant says, by birth we have a right to a piece of land, but the land rightfully now belongs to the other person, right? The other person rightfully bought it, and it's not his fault that the guy he bought it from didn't do anything good with the money, but just wasted it in alcohol. So what's the child of the drunkard going to do now? Here, of course, is exactly the point where Malthus would answer, well, tough luck for that child. That child now has no right to live because there is no property left. All the property is already distributed. It already rightfully belongs to someone. So all that child can do really is die. Of course, there's still one thing belonging to that child of the drunkard, and that is he himself, with his own power, his own workforce, right? He can work and he can sell his service, his workforce. But that would go beyond Kant. That's not something that Kant discusses, right? Then we would get into Fichte and we would go further, especially to Marx, and we would go to Marx's theory of there being two classes, right? The class that owns anything, that has the means of production, and the proletariat who don't own anything except their own workforce that they can sell. But this goes beyond Kant's theory. So to Kant, I would posit the question, what do you suggest here? And Kant himself, at some point rightly, but also in contradiction with this theory of his, does say that you cannot even truly own the ground. Because to Kant, ownership of a thing, ownership of an item, means that you truly are the master of this item, meaning you can move it wherever you want. And you cannot move the ground, right? The ground is truly immovable. Even a house standing on the ground is easier to move than the ground. And second, and mostly, you can destroy it. Maybe you shouldn't, maybe it's a waste, but you can rightfully do so. If you own something, then you don't have to use it in a sensible manner, but rather you have every right to just destroy it, right? If you own a house, you don't have to live in it. If you want, you have a right to tear it down. No one can tell you not to do this. Well, Kant says the land is indestructible. Not only can we not move it, we cannot destroy it. We can maybe destroy what's on the land, right? If there are animals on our land, we can kill them. If there's a forest on our land, we can burn it down. But the land as such can neither be moved nor destroyed, which is why Kant says, in the strictest sense, we cannot own the land. We cannot have a right to the land as such. We can only own the use of the land. That is, we can have an exclusive right to use the land. We can be the only one who is allowed to build on this land, to farm this land, to mine on this land, to hunt on this land. But all of that is not truly ownership of the land as such. It's just an ownership of the right to make use of the land. I would say that this is a correct remark of Kant's, but again, it goes against his whole theory that originally we, all of us, all of humankind, together own all of the land, right? He should rather then have said that originally we together all have the right to use the land. So therefore, I would say this theory of Kant is lacking in these regards. And it's not just the theory of original acquisition that is lacking. I would say there's a big gap in Kant's philosophy of right because he has no real economical theories, right? Like economics, it's not that it wasn't discussed at all in Kant's days, right? I mean, there were already people like Adam Smith, for example, or Malthus, who was also an economist, or Ricardo, or whoever, but in Kant's thinking, economic questions don't really play a role. He is only concerned with legal questions. But I would say that you cannot fully separate them, right? So Kant, in his doctrine of right, he does discuss things like ownership, what is rightful property, what is rightful original acquisition. He also goes into discussing some legal questions of his time, like, for example, if you have rented a house and now the owner of the house sells the house, does the new owner have the right to kick you out because he's not the one who rented it to you? Or does he have to accept you as the tenant and only has the right to now receive your rent that previously you paid to somebody else? This is something Kant discusses. Likewise, he tries to discuss all possible kinds of contracts that can transfer property, like the contract of selling, the contract of lending, the contract of renting. Tries to deduce them from the table of categories. That is something he does. Also, he discusses what is money as a means of exchanging goods. But still, there's no real economic theory, I would say, because Kant is also not concerned with value. What is value? How does value come about? Like when you read what Kant does say about buying and selling and so on, you could think a bit that the value is completely arbitrary, that there are no laws of economy that determine the value of a thing, but rather, or that you cannot derive from reason at what value a thing should have, but rather that it just simply is arbitrary. It just depends on what price you are selling and what price somebody else is willing to pay. So again, these are things that after Kant, Fichte takes up these topics, and then of course a bit later you have the early socialists, and then of course you have Marx and Engels. So later thinkers have started to get into these topics, but this is something that Kant himself doesn't yet truly discuss. And maybe here, more so than in other parts of his philosophy, you can say that he was still a man of his time. While in other parts of his thinking, he criticized the thinking of his time, and he went beyond the common beliefs, the common prejudices of his time. Here, for all his sharpness of mind and for all his originality in other areas of thinking, here he is still very much a person of the 18th century, while even with the next generation, it's quite striking, I would say. I mean, Fichte was also, of course, born in the 18th century, but still, he in a way is already a much more modern man. And then, of course, you have all these thinkers of the 19th century, like Marx or Engels. I mean, in the 18th century, had um, you still had some sort of feudalism, right? This was like the last century of feudalism. I already mentioned in the previous lecture how at the end of Kant's lifetime, or also some years after, serfdom was abolished, for example. And then, of course, shortly after Kant's death, you have the Industrial Revolution. So I would say that Kant in his thinking here is still influenced by feudalism. And of course, in feudalism, everything depends on the land and on land ownership and on farming the land. And I would say this kind of shows in Kant's theories. So I would say while his theory of original acquisition through the ownership of the land, while you should familiarize yourself with it if you want to understand Kant's philosophy of right, because all his other thoughts on right depend on that. And while the theory does have some merit, it does include some, I think, important thoughts or sentiments, and gives some sort of alternative to someone like Malthus. Ultimately, it doesn't truly solve the question of original acquisition. And just to not leave you hanging, I want to at least say one or two sentences about how it can be solved, because I would say that Fichte solved it, and Fichte solved it through simply people's plans, people's, you could say, right to have a future. Fichte would say it's not necessary that we start with original land ownership. We can just start with this original innate right to our freedom. But being free, being truly free, means being able to make plans. It means being able to have an effect in nature, like to do something and to then have the result that I planned for. For example, to plant on a field and to then at the end of the year harvest the crops so that I have food for the winter, or for example to dam a river and to then fish in the lake there so that I have fish or whatever. I have a right for my plans to come to fruition. I have a right as a rational being to actually use my rationality to act upon nature. And it is for that reason that I must have property. So property must be that which I require for my plans. And so in a way, Fichte would, with more consistency, say that in a truest sense, we can never own an object. Not just we cannot own land, like Kant says, we cannot own any object. What we can own is the exclusive right to use an object. What we can own is the right to restrict other people's usage, to say to other people, you mustn't use this object because it would interfere with my plans. And I have a right to plan. I have a right to use my freedom, my rationality, to create a certain future for myself in the world. Now that's very brief. One day I want to also talk as extensively as I talk about Kant here, about Fichte's philosophy as well as about others. And then I will certainly explain this further. Here I just wanted to mention it briefly because this is still a Kant lecture and not a Fichte lecture. But I don't want to end this just saying, okay, Kant's theory is wrong, and sort of sending people back to square one, not knowing what the right theory is. But at least I wanted to mention what I consider to be the right theory of original acquisition, even if I do not explain it in further detail here in this lecture for now. But with that, I'm done with the private right. I've now explained what private rights there are. I have now explained how, according to Kant, we acquire rights, we acquire property. And now I have already mentioned that the property can only truly be secured if other people agree that it is my property, if other people grant me that right in return for me granting them right to their property. That is, if we create a social contract, that is, if we make the private right public, a publicly stated right through laws and a publicly enforced right. And that is why in the next upcoming lectures I will talk about the public right, and I will talk about what Kant has to say, first of all, about the state and why we need a state and how the state should function. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklären course.